The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur of anticipation as Officer Ryan Cooper took the stand. Clad in his crisp police uniform, his posture radiated confidence, the kind built over years of wearing the badge with unquestioned authority. As he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, a flicker of smugness passed over his face, unnoticed by most, but not by Danielle Brooks, the woman seated at the defense table. Ryan Cooper spoke with a firm voice, painting a picture of a routine disturbance that allegedly turned violent when Danielle, a black woman, refused to comply with his commands. He described her as belligerent, aggressive, and dangerous, carefully choosing words that would instill fear and bias in the hearts of the jury. Danielle sat quietly, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her, her back straight as if held by an invisible line of dignity. She wore a simple, well-pressed navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, projecting an air of calm professionalism rather than the image of a criminal. Her dark eyes remained steady, occasionally flickering toward Officer Cooper, but never lingering. To the casual observer, she appeared serene, even detached, but beneath the surface a quiet storm of strength and patience brewed. Danielle's composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the vivid, almost theatrical narrative being spun from the witness stand, making some spectators exchange puzzled glances, as Cooper continued embellishing details with the ease of someone who had done this dance many times before the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. He claimed Danielle had yelled at him, refused to provide identification, and even attempted to grab his weapon, a serious allegation that left a few jurors visibly disturbed. He recounted the moment he said he had no choice but to restrain her, painting himself as the reluctant hero forced into a regrettable confrontation. Throughout it all, Danielle remained utterly still, absorbing every word like a sponge, her expression giving nothing away. Her stillness was not one of fear, but of calculation, of a deep awareness that her moment to speak would come. The prosecution leaned heavily into Cooper's narrative, treating his words as gospel. They paraded his years of service, his commendations, and his reputation as a dedicated officer before the court, building an image of a trustworthy public servant wronged by an unruly citizen. Yet for all the layers of credibility they heaped upon Cooper, the seed of doubt had already been planted. The courtroom's energy shifted subtly with every glance toward Danielle, every glimpse of her measured breathing and quiet strength. It was becoming harder and harder for those watching to reconcile the officer's dramatic tale with the composed woman sitting before them. Danielle's lawyer, Brandon Foster, watched from his seat, his heart pounding in his chest as he jotted quick notes. He knew appearances could sway a trial as much as facts, and he felt the silent tug of sympathy moving toward his client. Still, he also knew better than anyone that the road ahead was treacherous. Danielle's calmness was both her shield and her sword. It unsettled Cooper more than any outburst ever could have. Brandon glanced at her, seeking some sign of nerves or frustration, but found only the steely resolve of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. As the prosecution concluded their direct examination, Officer Cooper stepped down from the witness stand with the same confident smirk he had worn when he entered. He believed he had convinced the room of Danielle's guilt, but Danielle remained seated, unshaken, her mind sharp and her spirit unbowed. She knew the truth would not stay buried for long. What the officer, the jury, and even the judge did not yet realize was that beneath Danielle's composed exterior was a story far more powerful and honorable than any they could have imagined. A story that, once revealed, would turn everything on its head. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Danielle Brooks approached the witness stand, her every step deliberate and composed. The weight of dozens of eyes followed her, some skeptical, others curious, but Danielle appeared untouched by their scrutiny. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone with quiet confidence, and folded her hands neatly in front of her. The judge gave her a nod, and the prosecutor immediately pounced with a tone thick with skepticism. "Miss Brooks, can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Danielle lifted her gaze steadily, her voice clear and calm as she replied, "Yes, I can. I was checking my phone for directions. I had stopped on the sidewalk, minding my own business, when Officer Cooper approached me. Her tone carried neither anger nor bitterness, only the unshakable cadence of truth. As she spoke, the room leaned in without realizing it. Danielle continued recounting every moment with meticulous detail, each word a brick laid carefully to construct the real narrative. She explained how she stood quietly near the corner, uncertain of her next turn, and how Cooper's flashlight had suddenly blinded her as he barked questions in a tone that suggested guilt long before any answers were given. She recounted her confusion, her attempts to clarify why he needed her identification, and how those questions seemed to enrage him rather than satisfy him. With every sentence, Danielle peeled back the layers of Cooper's version of events, exposing it for what it was, a house of cards built on assumptions and aggression. Brandon Foster, seated at the defense table, watched in awe as Danielle's testimony shifted the atmosphere in the room. The jury, once passively listening, now leaned forward in their seats. Even Judge Whitmore, who had maintained a strict neutrality until now, seemed more attentive, his pen frozen mid-note as Danielle spoke. She did not embellish her story with unnecessary emotion, nor did she seek sympathy. She simply told the truth, the unvarnished truth, in a way that made it impossible to ignore the humanity stripped from her in Officer Cooper's earlier account. She spoke of the fear that bloomed quietly when a man with a badge used authority as a weapon, not as a shield. When the prosecutor tried to interject, suggesting that Danielle's questioning of the officer was in itself an act of defiance, she met his interruption with a simple, powerful correction. I questioned his motive, not his authority. Her voice remained level, unshaken by the pointed challenge. She described how asking a question, "What have I done wrong?" was met with escalating aggression rather than an explanation. Danielle's recollection was so precise, so grounded, that even those in the gallery who had once whispered assumptions about her guilt found themselves shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The narrative Cooper had spun was starting to unravel, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it. Throughout her testimony, Danielle never once raised her voice. Her strength was in her restraint, her power in her precision. She spoke about how Cooper grabbed her arm without warning, how his grip tightened painfully when she asked him to let go, and how she instinctively tried to pull away, not out of defiance, but out of fear. "He saw me not as a citizen asking a question," she said, her voice steady, "but as a threat that needed to be subdued." The room held its breath as her words echoed against the high ceilings, slicing through the air, heavier than any accusation ever could. In that moment, it wasn't just Officer Cooper on trial. It was a system, a way of thinking that assumed guilt based on nothing more than presence and color. As Danielle concluded her testimony for the day, she sat back in her chair, her hands folding once more on the table, her eyes meeting the jury's with a calm defiance. She had planted seeds of doubt with her every word, seeds that were quickly taking root in the minds of those tasked with determining her fate. The prosecutor looked rattled, flipping through his notes with a new urgency, realizing too late that their star witness officer, Ryan Cooper, no longer appeared so infallible. And as Danielle glanced briefly at Brandon Foster, she saw in his quiet smile the reflection of what she had just achieved, the beginning of a tectonic shift, one that would before long break the foundations of the lie built against her. Danielle Brooks sat calmly at the witness stand, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze unwavering as Brandon Foster approached the court with a quiet, focused determination. The judge gave a nod, allowing Brandon to proceed. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Earlier testimony suggested that Officer Cooper's body camera failed to capture the incident in question. Is that correct?" Danielle lifted her chin slightly, her tone measured and deliberate as she replied, "That is correct. Officer Cooper informed me during the arrest that his body camera had malfunctioned." A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Danielle remained composed, allowing the words to hang in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to dismiss their significance. Brandon moved with careful precision, each step in front of the jury calculated to drive the point deeper. Miss Brooks, based on your experience that night, would you consider that malfunction coincidental? He asked. Danielle did not hesitate. No, I would not, she said plainly, her voice cutting through the courtroom's rising tension. I believe it was either a fabrication or a deliberate action. Her statement landed like a thunderclap, and even the judge's pen stilled mid-note. Eyes flickered toward Officer Cooper, whose once steady composure now showed the first signs of visible strain, the subtle clenching of his jaw, the way his hands tightened on the table. None of it escaped Danielle's notice. Brandon took a breath, reaching into his briefcase and retrieving a small, innocuous-looking USB drive. Your Honor, he said. Addressing the bench, the defense would like to introduce newly discovered evidence, a video captured by a bystander during the incident. The prosecutor immediately rose in protest, but Judge Whitmore's hand shot up before he could finish his objection. Overruled. Let's see it, the judge ordered firmly. As the bailiff inserted the drive into the courtroom's media system, the gallery leaned forward as one. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy footage began to play. At first, only muffled sounds and blurry movement filled the screen, but then unmistakably the confrontation came into view, sharp, brutal, and damning. The video showed Officer Cooper grabbing Danielle by the arm, wrenching it behind her back as she struggled to maintain her balance. Her voice was clear, firm, but not aggressive. I am not resisting. Let go of my arm. Cooper's response was a shove, pushing her against the patrol car with enough force to make the entire vehicle rock. There was no sign of Danielle reaching for his weapon, no threats, no signs of violence from her side, only the raw display of unnecessary force. Gasps echoed around the room louder this time, and Judge Whitmore's gavel struck sharply against the bench. Order, he barked, though even he struggled to mask the emotion that flickered across his face. As the video ended, the courtroom was blanketed in a heavy electric silence. Officer Cooper's earlier testimony now hung in the air like a rotten fruit, exposed and undeniable. Danielle sat still, letting the footage speak for itself, refusing to gloat or even shift in her seat. Brandon, meanwhile, allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that every second amplified the growing realization among the jury and spectators alike. He approached the jury box, his voice low but forceful. You have now seen what the officer claimed did not exist. You have heard what he said under oath. The question before you is not simply about Miss Brooks's innocence. It is about the credibility of those sworn to protect and serve. At the defense table, Danielle inhaled slowly, steadying herself for what she knew was only the beginning of a longer battle, but as she looked around the room at the jurors now exchanging uncertain glances, at the prosecutor's tightened jaw, at the once smirking Officer Cooper, now visibly rattled, she felt the first true shift in momentum. She had not needed to yell or plead. The truth captured in the shaky frame of a stranger's cell phone had spoken more powerfully than any words ever could. And as Danielle straightened her spine and lifted her gaze once more to the judge, she knew the foundation of lies built against her was beginning to crumble, and there would be no way to stop the collapse. The courthouse emptied slowly, the day's revelations leaving behind a thick residue of tension and disbelief. Danielle Brooks walked calmly down the courthouse steps, her posture unyielding, her steps measured. Brandon Foster hurried to catch up with her, his mind racing faster than his feet. As they reached the relative quiet of a nearby parking lot, Brandon finally spoke his voice, a strained whisper. Danielle, he said, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot, whatever you're holding back, you need to tell me now. We're on the edge of something huge, and if there's more, I have to know. Before we step into court tomorrow, Danielle paused near her car, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, then turned to face him with a look that was at once serious and oddly serene. Without a word, Danielle gestured for him to follow. They drove in silence to her modest home on the outskirts of town, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of tires against the road. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The house was clean and spare, decorated with care but without pretense, Brandon's eyes were immediately drawn to a framed photo sitting atop the fireplace, a younger Danielle clad in a sharply pressed uniform, standing proudly beside a much older man. His heart quickened, but he said nothing as Danielle crossed the room, pulling a worn leather folder from a bookshelf. She handed it to him without ceremony. "Open it," she said simply. Settling into a nearby chair, Brandon's fingers hesitated at the edge before flipping the cover open, his breath catching in his throat as he read the words stamped across the top: United States Navy SEALs, Service Record. For a long moment, neither spoke. Brandon leafed through the documents with growing disbelief. Deployment, orders, commendations, letters of recognition. His eyes widened as he came across mission briefings and classified operations Danielle had been part of. Lieutenant Commander Danielle Brooks. He murmured aloud the title, feeling surreal in the cozy living room. When he finally looked up, Danielle met his stunned gaze with a quiet smile. "I served for 20 years, she said. "I've led missions most people couldn't even imagine. I walked into danger so others could stay safe." Her voice was neither boastful nor bitter. It was a simple statement of fact. Brandon shook his head slowly, overwhelmed not just by the revelation itself, but by the realization of the strategy Danielle had crafted with such precision. "You could have crushed him today with this," Brandon said, his voice still hushed as though speaking too loudly might break the delicate moment. "Why didn't you reveal this already?" Danielle leaned back slightly, her hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. "Because timing matters," she explained. "If I had told them today, it would have been seen as a defense mechanism, a way to make myself look better. But if I wait, if I let their lies dig deeper, if I let the courtroom believe I am just an ordinary woman, then when the truth comes out, it will dismantle their credibility completely." Brandon stared at her, awed not only by her courage, but by her razor-sharp understanding of human behavior. She wasn't just defending herself. She was orchestrating a complete unraveling of a system that had wronged her. Brandon stood up, pacing the room, the weight of the new information settling onto his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Danielle," he said after a long pause, "this is bigger than you. This isn't just about getting you acquitted. This is about exposing a sickness that runs deeper than one bad cop. It's about showing everyone that the system can't hide behind uniforms and badges anymore." Danielle's expression didn't change. It had been her mission from the start, even if Brandon was only now seeing it clearly. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had been swept neatly under the rug, and the power of that revelation was bigger than any single trial, any single courtroom. Finally, Brandon stopped pacing, turning to face her with a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll do it your way," he said. "But when the moment comes, we hit them with everything." Danielle's lips curved into a faint but fierce smile. "We will." She promised, her voice steady and calm. She reached out, closing the leather folder with a quiet snap. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the tall oaks surrounding her home, and somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of a siren rose and fell. Danielle ignored it. She had spent her life navigating battlefields, both seen and unseen. Tomorrow she would walk into the courtroom, not just as Danielle Brooks, a woman accused, but as Lieutenant Commander Danielle Brooks, a warrior armed with truth, and the system would have no defense against her. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the courthouse, casting pale beams across the polished wooden floors as the courtroom slowly filled. Word of the explosive revelations from the previous day had spread like wildfire, drawing in spectators who now packed the benches, murmuring among themselves in restless anticipation. Danielle Brooks sat at the defense table, wearing a navy blue blazer that seemed to enhance the quiet authority radiating from her every movement. Brandon Foster sat beside her, his face a picture of calm readiness, though inside his heart beat a steady drum of anticipation. The judge entered, calling the room to order with a stern glance that immediately silenced the crowd. Brandon stood first. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "the defense calls Danielle Brooks to the stand." A ripple moved through the room as Danielle rose her movements, deliberate every step carrying the weight of the moment to come. Danielle took the stand with a dignity that could not be faked or forced. She adjusted the microphone, folded her hands in her lap, and turned her gaze toward the jury, her face open and unflinching. Brandon approached slowly, allowing the courtroom to absorb the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "Many in this room have heard conflicting accounts of your character and your actions. For the sake of clarity and truth, would you please tell the court who you are?" Danielle nodded slightly, her voice cutting through the silence with a clarity that sent a visible ripple through the crowd. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Danielle Brooks, United States Navy, retired," she said. "I served for 20 years as a Navy SEAL, leading operations in some of the most dangerous environments in the world." Gasps rose unbidden from the gallery, and even the judge leaned slightly forward, his normally impassive expression betraying a flicker of surprise. Danielle continued, her voice steady and sure, her words slicing cleanly through the charged air. She spoke of her training, of the discipline and resilience instilled in her from her earliest days in the Navy. "We were taught to stay calm under pressure," she said, "to assess threats without escalating situations unnecessarily, to use force only as a last resort, and even then with precision and accountability." She explained how in combat zones across the globe, her ability to stay composed had saved lives, both her own and those of countless others. She told them how restraint was not weakness, but strength, how every move she made, even in the face of danger, was guided by purpose, control, and respect for the value of life. Every eye in the room remained locked on her, every mind grappling with the staggering contrast between the woman Officer Cooper had tried to portray and the warrior who now stood before them. The prosecution shifted uneasily at their table, their earlier confidence unraveling like a frayed thread. The jurors, who had once listened with skeptical detachment, now leaned forward with rapt attention. Danielle's words painted a picture that no cross-examination could undo, a portrait of honor, sacrifice, and unwavering principle. Even Officer Cooper, sitting stiffly at the plaintiff's table, seemed to shrink in his chair, his face flushing with the realization that the courtroom's perception had shifted irreversibly. Danielle spoke not with anger or bitterness, but with the calm assurance of someone who had faced down true danger and survived. She explained how even when Cooper had grabbed her arm, even when she felt the sting of injustice rising in her chest, her instincts had been to de-escalate, to protect both herself and the situation from unnecessary violence. As Danielle concluded her testimony, she turned once more to the jury, her voice softer now but no less commanding. "The truth," she said, "is not loud. It does not need to shout. It stands firm even when the ground shakes beneath it." She let the silence that followed settle deeply into the bones of the courtroom, knowing that nothing more needed to be said. The transformation in the room was almost tangible. Respect replaced skepticism. Admiration took the place of doubt. Brandon gave her a slight nod as she returned to her seat, and Danielle sat down slowly, knowing the power of what she had just done. She had not defended herself through defiance or outrage. She had revealed the truth of who she was, and in doing so dismantled the lies stacked against her more effectively than any evidence or argument ever could. For a long moment after Danielle sat down, no one moved. The judge, usually so quick to break tension with the rap of his gavel, simply stared at her, as if weighing the full measure of the revelation he had just witnessed. Brandon remained standing at the defense table, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. Around the room, faces once hardened with judgment softened into expressions of deep reflection. It wasn't just Danielle's military title that had changed the air. It was the strength of her truth, the dignity she carried even after being dragged unjustly into that courtroom. The battle was not yet won, but as Danielle sat there, a calm force in the eye of a storm she had refused to let define her. It was clear to everyone present that the ground had shifted and there would be no going back. The courtroom was heavy with expectation as Officer Ryan Cooper was called back to the stand. He moved slower than before, the swagger that once characterized his steps, now replaced by a stiffness that betrayed the turmoil brewing beneath his uniformed exterior. The bailiff administered the oath once more, and as Cooper settled into the witness chair, his hands betrayed him, fidgeting, clenching, unclenching. Brandon Foster rose from the defense table, his approach unhurried, almost casual, but his eyes held a sharpness that made Cooper squirm before a single question was asked. Brandon paused at the lectern, giving the moment time to settle. Then, with a calm voice that carried clearly across the silent room, he began, "Officer Cooper, under oath you testified that Miss Brooks resisted arrest and attempted to reach for your weapon. Is that still your statement today?" Cooper cleared his throat, his voice raspy as he answered, "Yes, it is." Brandon nodded slowly, as if giving the officer a chance to anchor himself before pulling the ground out from under him. "And yet," Brandon continued, "you also testified that your body camera malfunctioned during this critical encounter." "Correct." Cooper nodded stiffly. "Convenient," Brandon said lightly, letting the word dangle in the air before striking. "Tell me, officer, how often has your body camera malfunctioned during arrests over the past year?" Cooper hesitated, his mouth opening and closing for a brief moment before he managed a response. "It's rare," he admitted. Brandon stepped closer, his tone sharpening just enough to slice. "Rare. But it happened during the one arrest where the defendant allegedly attacked you and reached for your weapon." The jury leaned forward as Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his credibility crumbling by the second. The pressure mounted as Brandon systematically dismantled Cooper's account. He produced a report from the police department's equipment logs showing that Cooper's assigned body camera had passed inspection just days before the incident. "So your camera was working properly," Brandon said, tapping the report lightly with his finger until the moment it mattered most. Cooper's jaw tightened. "It malfunctioned." He insisted weakly. Brandon didn't press immediately. Instead, he allowed the officer's increasingly defensive posture to do the work for him. Turning to the jury, Brandon gestured subtly toward the video evidence already shown footage that captured Cooper's aggressive behavior and Danielle's calm resistance. "And yet," Brandon said, turning back to Cooper, "the bystander's video, the only independent record we have, shows no sign of Miss Brooks reaching for your weapon. None. It shows you escalating an encounter with a citizen who had done nothing wrong. How do you explain that?" "Officer Cooper." Cooper's face flushed red, and for a moment he struggled to find his words. "The video doesn't show everything," he muttered. "It's out of context." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Out of context," he echoed. "Officer, context does not change the fact that Miss Brooks clearly states, 'I am not resisting.' Context does not change the fact that you shoved her against a car after she questioned your authority, a right every citizen has under the law." If the jury's faces hardened, the seeds of doubt blossoming into full-grown skepticism. Cooper shifted again, tugging at the collar of his uniform as if it were suddenly strangling him. His hands, once confidently folded, now gripped the arms of the chair with white-knuckled desperation, and every passing second saw his authority and reliability dissolving before their eyes. Brandon moved in for the final blow, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "Officer Cooper," he said, pausing until every ear was tuned to him, "you ask this jury to trust your word over documented evidence, over independent eyewitness accounts, over the integrity of a woman who has spent her life defending this country. Yet in your testimony, there are inconsistencies, missing footage, and no physical evidence whatsoever to support your claims." He stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the authority of a man who knew he had already won the ground beneath him. "Tell me, Officer Cooper, why should anyone believe you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Cooper's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The silence was louder than any confession. Brandon turned and walked back to the defense table, leaving Cooper to sit there exposed, unraveling the weight of his own lies bearing down on him. As Brandon took his seat next to Danielle, a heavy stillness filled the courtroom. The jury avoided looking at Cooper. now their eyes flickering instead toward Danielle with expressions of remorse and respect. Cooper sat frozen, a man stripped bare with nothing left but the uniform that now seemed more like a costume than a symbol of duty. Danielle remained serene, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her presence a quiet but overwhelming force. The prosecution's earlier narrative had been shattered beyond repair, the pedestal on which Cooper once stood reduced to rubble. The courtroom had seen the truth not through angry outbursts or dramatic gestures, but through the calm persistence of a woman who refused to let lies define her story. And in that truth, the jury found clarity, and the system felt its walls begin to shake. The tension inside the courtroom had shifted from one of uncertainty to a heavy, simmering anticipation. Brandon Foster rose slowly from his seat, his fingers brushing against the thick folder placed purposefully on the defense table. Every eye in the room followed him as he moved to the center of the floor, the weight of what was about to be revealed hanging palpably in the air. He held the folder high enough for the jury to see, allowing the silence to build to press against their skin. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice low but carrying strength, "what you have witnessed so far is troubling. But what you are about to see is the undeniable truth that Officer Ryan Cooper's actions were not an isolated lapse in judgment. They are part of a dangerous and persistent pattern." Brandon opened the folder carefully, like a man revealing a long hidden wound, and pulled out a series of documents stamped with official seals. "This," he said, holding up a page, "is Officer Cooper's personnel file obtained through lawful discovery." The judge gave a brief nod, permitting him to proceed. Brandon continued reading from the file, in an even tone that left no room for doubt or confusion. Multiple complaints of excessive force. He stated documented instances of racial bias, internal investigations that were quietly closed with warnings instead of consequences. Gasps whispered through the courtroom as he read off incident after incident, cases that mirrored Danielle's experience stories of citizens, especially those of color, treated with the same presumption of guilt, the same escalation without cause. Brandon laid the papers down before the jury, letting the inked evidence tell its own damning story. The jury's faces darkened as they flipped through the copies placed before them. Even spectators who had arrived neutral or skeptical now wore expressions of shock, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. Officer Cooper, who had once projected the image of a wronged guardian of the law, now sat exposed as something far less noble. It was no longer just Danielle's word against his. It was a pattern, a history, a series of choices made again and again. Brandon stepped closer to the jury, his voice quieter now, more intimate, as if speaking directly to each heart in the room. "This case isn't just about Danielle Brooks," he said. "It's about every citizen officer. Cooper intimidated every voice. He silenced every truth he buried under the weight of his badge." Danielle sat still at the defense table, but the atmosphere around her seemed to shift. She was no longer simply a defendant fighting for her freedom. She had become a symbol, a reflection of the countless others who had never seen their day in court, who had never been believed. She watched as understanding dawned across the jury's faces and then spread to the spectators behind them. For the first time, the courtroom truly saw her, not as a figure caught in an unfortunate incident, but as a warrior standing at the crossroads of personal and systemic injustice. Brandon gave her a subtle nod, and in that silent exchange, they both understood that the battle they were fighting was no longer just hers to bear. Brandon's voice grew stronger as he delivered the final blow. "A system that protects and enables behavior like Officer Cooper's is a system in desperate need of accountability." He declared, "If we turn a blind eye, we are complicit. If we excuse his pattern of abuse because of a title or a uniform, we allow injustice to flourish in the very places meant to shield us from it." His words struck deep, leaving ripples of emotion across the sea of faces turned toward him. He didn't shout, he didn't dramatize. He simply spoke the truth, raw, undeniable, and piercing. Danielle's quiet strength anchored his words, her silent presence reinforcing every syllable like an invisible army standing behind him. As Brandon returned to his seat, the room remained frozen in heavy silence, broken only by the soft rustle of jurors turning pages and the occasional clearing of a throat thick with emotion. Danielle sat taller now, her hands clasped gently on the table, her gaze steady and calm. She was no longer just defending herself. She was carrying the weight of a much larger truth, one that resonated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. In the heart of that silence, a transformation had taken place. Danielle Brooks was no longer seen as a solitary figure fighting alone. She had become a catalyst for change, a voice for every person who had ever been judged, mistreated, or silenced simply because of who they were. And now, with the truth laid bare for all to see, there was no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with a low, anxious energy as the judge called both sides forward for closing arguments. Prosecutor Richard Avery was the first to rise, smoothing down his tailored suit with a quick, nervous gesture before stepping toward the jury box. His confidence, so evident earlier in the trial, now seemed more forced, the weight of recent revelations pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Officer Cooper, who sat rigid and pale at the plaintiff's table. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Avery began, his voice measured but lacking the sharp certainty it once held, "we ask you to remember that law enforcement officers must make split-second decisions under challenging circumstances. Yes, mistakes were made, and perhaps not every action taken by Officer Cooper was perfect. But imperfection does not erase his fundamental duty to protect and serve." Avery paced slowly, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he spoke. "This case is not about judging an officer's career based on a single moment." He continued, trying to weave a thread of sympathy for Cooper. "It is about understanding the pressures of the badge, the challenges of the street officer. Cooper did what he believed necessary to maintain public safety." His voice grew slightly more urgent, sensing the jury's reluctance to follow him. "If we condemn every mistake as malicious, we discourage good men and women from taking up the call of service." He paused, letting the words settle, but the reaction in the room was muted at best. The jury members wore guarded expressions, their faces revealing little sympathy for a narrative that seemed increasingly hollow in the face of all they had witnessed. When Avery concluded and returned to his seat, Brandon Foster rose without hurry, adjusting his jacket with a calm deliberateness that commanded attention without demanding it. He moved to the center of the room and let the silence breathe for a few long seconds before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong but rich with emotion, "this case is not about punishing someone for doing their job. It is about demanding accountability when power is abused. It is about drawing a line in the sand and saying enough." He turned, slightly gesturing toward Danielle, who sat with her head held high, every inch the image of quiet resilience. "Danielle Brooks is not here because she broke the law. She is here because she had the audacity to ask why, and for that she was punished." Brandon's voice grew steadier, weaving truth into every word. "This woman spent 2 decades defending the rights and freedoms we all take for granted. She was trained to remain calm under the most unimaginable pressure to preserve life even when threatened. And what did she do here in the very country she served? She stood on a sidewalk. She asked a question. She refused to be intimidated, and for that she was treated as a criminal." He paused, locking eyes with the jury, willing them to feel the injustice as deeply as he did. "The prosecution asks you to trust the system despite its flaws," Brandon said, his voice tightening with conviction. "I ask you to demand better because justice is not built on blind loyalty. It is built on truth, accountability, and the dignity of every individual." The jury listened in rapt silence, the emotional weight in the room becoming almost unbearable. Some jurors blinked rapidly, fighting off the sting of unshed tears. Others clenched their jaws, their hands tightening into fists on their laps. Brandon's words layered over the evidence. Danielle's testimony and Cooper's collapse had built a tidal wave of realization that now crashed over them. Brandon stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper, making each word strike harder. "Today, you have the power to say that dignity matters. that truth matters, that no one, not even those given a badge and authority, stands above the law. His words hung suspended in the heavy air, a solemn vow of what justice demanded. As Brandon returned to his seat, the courtroom remained hushed, every person present feeling the enormity of the moment. Danielle sat as she always had, quiet, composed, and unbreakable, the embodiment of the fight for justice that had played out before their eyes. The judge gave the jury their instructions, his own voice, carrying an unusual gravitas, aware that this case would not fade quietly into the annals of court records. As the jury filed out to deliberate, heads bowed in serious thought, there was a collective understanding in the room. The choice before them was not complicated by procedure or technicality. It was simple. It was about truth and whether they had the courage to stand on the side of it. And it was clear from the glistening eyes and the firm set of their jaws that Danielle Brooks had already won more than just their attention. She had won their respect. The jury filed out of the courtroom, their faces etched with the weight of the responsibility they carried. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, and the room slipped into a tense, almost reverent silence. Danielle Brooks sat at the defense table, her hands resting lightly atop one another, her breathing slow and steady. Brandon Foster sat beside her, pretending to shuffle papers, though his mind was racing across the aisle. Officer Ryan Cooper sat rigid, his pale face betraying the mounting dread he could no longer conceal. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the minutes ticked by, each second steeped in the collective breath-holding of a courtroom waiting for judgment. No one spoke. No one moved. They all simply waited, the air thick with expectation, fear, and hope. When the bailiff finally re-entered the room, snapped to attention. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced, his voice booming across the stillness. People shifted in their seats, reporters readied their pens, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression grave. The jury filed back into the box, each member carrying the invisible imprint of the journey they had taken behind closed doors. Danielle watched them carefully, seeing in their tight lips and guarded eyes the enormity of what they had wrestled with. The foreperson, a woman with steady hands and kind eyes, stood as the judge instructed. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" he asked. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, though a tremor of emotion danced at its edge. The court clerk took the paper from her and handed it to the judge, who unfolded it, slowly scanning its contents with the solemnity the moment demanded. Then he nodded once sharply and returned his gaze to the courtroom. "In the case of the state versus Danielle Brooks," he intoned, "we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." For a beat, the room was silent, the words sinking in. Then, like a dam breaking, emotion flooded the space. Gasps, cheers, and soft sobs rose into the high ceilings. Danielle exhaled for the first time in what felt like days, her body releasing tension she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. Brandon grinned, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, and the two exchanged a glance that spoke volumes without uttering a word. But the jury was not finished. The foreperson cleared her throat and addressed the court again. "Furthermore, we the jury strongly recommend that an official investigation be launched into Officer Cooper's conduct, both regarding this case and his prior record of service." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the room, this time tinged with a deeper sense of satisfaction, a sense that real change, not just personal vindication, might yet come from this long and painful battle. Officer Cooper's face crumpled under the weight of the announcement. He slumped slightly in his chair, a man laid bare before a community he had once sworn to protect. The judge nodded gravely, acknowledging the jury's recommendation with a look that promised action. As court adjourned, the room erupted into a celebration, not of victory over an individual, but of the triumph of resilience, truth, and dignity. Strangers Danielle had never met approached her with tears in their eyes, reaching out hands of solidarity and gratitude. Reporters shouted her name, desperate for a comment, but she moved through them with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout the trial. She shook hands, hugged supporters, and thanked those who had believed in her. her every gesture infused with the grace of someone who had never sought the spotlight but had earned it nonetheless. Brandon stayed close, a silent guardian in the chaos, his heart swelling with pride at what they had accomplished together. Outside the courthouse, under the broad blue sky, Danielle paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking in the scene. News cameras clicked and whirred, capturing the image of a woman who had stood against the crushing machinery of injustice and emerged unbroken. She turned to the waiting crowd, lifting her chin slightly, her voice calm and sure as she spoke. "This victory is not just for me," she said, her words carrying across the throng. "It's for every voice that has been silenced, every life treated as less than worthy. Justice is not given. It is fought for, and today we stood together and demanded it." The crowd erupted into applause as Danielle stepped forward into the sunlight, her spirit unyielding, her journey far from over, but her name now forever tied to the enduring power of truth. The verdict's echoes lingered far beyond the courtroom walls, rippling out into the streets, the city, and eventually across the nation. Within weeks, an internal review board concluded its investigation into Officer Ryan Cooper's conduct. Their findings as damning as the evidence revealed during Danielle Brooks' trial, Cooper was dismissed from the police force with immediate effect, his badge and uniform stripped away under the cold gaze of a department now desperate to distance itself from the scandal. Criminal charges followed swiftly: perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. For the first time, Officer Cooper faced consequences he had long evaded, and though the wheels of justice turned slowly, they turned with purpose, driven by the undeniable truth Danielle's courage had dragged into the light. Meanwhile, Danielle Brooks found herself thrust into a role she had never sought, but carried with quiet grace, that of a symbol. News outlets replayed her testimony, her composed dignity, her unwavering strength over and over again. Editorials praised her bravery, commentators lauded her restraint, and communities across the country found in her story a mirror for their own struggles against injustice. She received letters from young women, veterans, and ordinary citizens who saw in her a beacon of hope that the system could be challenged, that the voiceless could be heard. Danielle accepted the attention cautiously. Understanding that true change required more than applause, it demanded sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and an unwavering commitment to truth. As invitations poured in for interviews, speaking engagements, and advocacy work, Danielle chose her path carefully. She declined television appearances that sought to sensationalize her story, refusing to reduce her fight to a soundbite or a fleeting headline. Instead, she focused her energy on building bridges, working with grassroots organizations, speaking at community forums, and partnering with civil rights groups to push for meaningful reforms. "It's not enough to win my battle," she said during one gathering at a local church. "We have to make sure others don't have to fight the same one." Her words resonated deeply, planting seeds of action in audiences hungry for more than outrage. They wanted solutions, and Danielle was determined to help forge them. Danielle also found herself mentoring young people, especially young Black men and women, teaching them about their rights, about resilience, about the quiet, powerful strength of standing tall, even when the world tries to make you small. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a deep, patient understanding that real change required a shift, not just in laws, but in hearts and minds. In rooms filled with future leaders, she shared her journey not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of truth when wielded with courage and conviction. Each time she spoke, each hand she shook, each voice she encouraged. Danielle built a legacy that stretched far beyond her own name. At home, away from the cameras and crowds, Danielle still enjoyed her quiet moments, the early morning runs by the river, the afternoons spent with friends who had stood by her side, the evenings lost in books and reflection. She remained grounded, remembering the oath she had taken long ago as a Navy SEAL to serve something greater than herself. That promise had not ended with her military service. It lived on in her advocacy, her leadership, her unwillingness to accept injustice as an inevitability. She knew the road ahead would be long paved with resistance and setbacks, but she also knew she was not walking it alone. And for the first time in a long time, Danielle Brooks allowed herself a small, genuine smile, not of triumph, but of purpose fulfilled. As the years passed, Danielle's name became synonymous not just with survival, but with transformation. Policies changed, departments re-examined their practices, conversations once whispered in fear now roared in public squares. And through it all, Danielle remained a steady, unwavering force, a reminder that one voice backed by truth and fortified by courage could shake even the most immovable walls. Her courtroom battle may have ended with a gavel strike, but her real fight, the fight for dignity, equality, and justice for all, was only just beginning. And somewhere in cities and towns across the nation, in the hearts of those she had inspired, the legacy of Danielle Brooks continued to grow, like an unbreakable flame lighting the path forward for generations to come. If you found Danielle's story powerful and inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ, where we uncover the real stories of resilience, justice, and courage that often go untold. Every week we bring you narratives that challenge the system, celebrate human strength, and remind us that even in the darkest moments, truth and integrity can prevail. Join our community by hitting the subscribe button, turning on notifications, and sharing these important stories with others. Let's continue to amplify the voices that deserve to be heard and stand together for a world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality we fight for every day.